Hello everyone, welcome back to another one of John's never-ending list of random things to do. For today's video, I will be working on my 1985 Toyota Celica Supra. The issue here is, sometimes at idle, my voltage drops to about 12 volts, and browsing through the Celica Supra forums to fix this issue is to install a bigger alternator. Now if you're planning to replace the original alternator, or have plans to install the MKII alternator, refer to Russell Sanders' video. I'll leave a link to his video in the description below. And here are the Denso parts you are looking for. These two alternators are a direct fit. If you're using the MKII alternator, you'll need a 6-rib belt instead of a 7-rib, unless if you're machining the original alternator pulley to fit on the MKII alternator. Since this video is about installing the bigger alternator, here are their Denso part numbers. You can choose any one of these alternators. In this video, I installed an alternator from a 94 Lexus SC400. Now if you're not machining the original alternator pulley to fit on these alternators, then you'll need a 38-inch 6-rib belt. Now with all the information, let's get this project started. You want to start by removing the fan. Go ahead and remove the 4 nuts securing the fan clutch. Once all 4 nuts have been removed, remove the fan out of the way. Next, loosen the 3 14mm bolts securing the power steering pump. And now that the power steering pump is loose, go ahead and push it down to remove the power steering belt. If you didn't already do so, now would be a good time to remove the negative battery terminal connections. Then place it somewhere on the side where it won't make contact. You also want to remove the intake tubing to have easier access to the alternator connections. Now proceed to remove this nut and the cable. In order to remove this plug, press the tab in, then wiggle it out. In order to loosen the alternator, you have to move this nut in that direction. Then loosen this bolt right here. Next you want to loosen this bolt right here. Since there's a nut on the back side, you have to use a 14mm wrench to hold it in place while using a ratchet on this side. Now I left the bolts in place to hold the alternator, so I can remove the belt first. Now that everything is out of the way, proceed to remove this bolt completely. And this bolt down here as well. Now the alternator is ready to be removed. Go ahead and wiggle it out of its mounting point and carefully move it out of the way. So here we have the original alternator. And this here is the new replacement. Unfortunately, it's not a Denso alternator. Now let's check to see if this bolt fits. And it does. Alright, that's good. Now the top side of this is not threaded, so we'll have to find a bolt for this. Now for reinstalling, you don't want to go through the top side here. You'll find that it doesn't fit at all. What I did instead was, I placed the alternator on the ground right here. Then from above, I reached down as far as possible and grabbed the alternator and pulled it up. At this point, you have to maneuver the alternator and flip it around so that it fits into the bracket perfectly. I was lucky enough it went in pretty easy. Now you want to proceed to install the lower bolt so the alternator doesn't fall down. But don't install the bolt all the way. Remember to fix the bracket on the backside so the bolt goes through it as well. And once you've aligned it with the hole, proceed to insert the bolt completely. Here's the view from the backside and with the bracket installed. Now with this bolt here, we won't install the nut on the backside yet. We'll leave it loose. We'll get back to this point later on in the video. If this tensioning nut is still located here, proceed to wind it all the way to the end. Now you want to make sure the nut and bolt in these locations are loose. And you want to have the bracket about this loose. For this installation, this is the belt I will be using. And these are the hardware I obtained at a local AutoZone. You'll want to insert just the bolt by itself. Do not install the nut on the backside. Now proceed to install the new belt. Once the belt is in place, proceed to install the nut on the backside of the bolt. Next, it's time to reinstall the belts for the power steering pump. Go ahead and slide it back into its position. Don't forget to reinsert this plate right here. Then follow that up by reinserting the fan. Place it in like so, then mount it down. Now that the fan is reinstalled, go ahead and adjust the tensioner nut for the alternator. Now you want to make sure the belt is a little loose, because once you tighten this bolt, it'll increase the tension. Next, you'll want to retighten the bolt and the nut for this bracket. Now moving on to the power steering pump. Go ahead and apply tension to the belt and retighten the 3 bolts securing the power steering pump. Now remember, the nut on the backside of this bolt is still not installed yet. We're getting there shortly. And this plug here plugs right in. This positive terminal connector is too small. Now you have to cut it open and expand it, or you just might have to install a bigger ring connector. So go ahead and remove the first nut. Then make the proper connections. Now we won't install this nut just yet. With the alternator installed, let's have a look around just to see if there's any clearance issues. Everything is looking really good. Up next, you want to remove the air filter housing and the battery as well. In addition, you'll want to remove the two 12mm bolts securing the radiator. That way we have access to the front side of the radiator. If you're installing a bigger alternator, I would highly recommend you upgrade your electrical. All my wires are 0 gauge and 2 gauge wires, but if that's too big for you, you can get away with a 4 gauge wire. Just make sure they're pure copper wires. I'm using the 0 gauge wire from the positive terminal of the alternator to this breaker. Now this will be a 120 amp breaker since the alternator is rated at 100 amps. The length of this wire from mounting point to mounting point is 68 inches, but I highly recommend you make it 69 or 70 inches. And the length I have from the breaker to the positive terminal battery is 14 inches. But you might want to make yours 13 or 12 inches, depending on how much longer you made the initial wire. This 2 gauge 50 inch wire will run from the negative battery terminal to the starter. This wire is not really needed, but I installed it anyway. It really helped on those cold start days. This 2 gauge 39 inch wire will run from the negative battery terminal to the engine block. You'll want to make sure the terminal is bent a little like so. This 2 gauge 17 inch wire will be connected from the starter to the chassis. And last of all, this 2 gauge 8 inch wire will be connected from the negative battery terminal to the body. I would recommend you make this cable at least 10 inches long. Now it's time to make the positive terminal connection here. This is the reason why we didn't install this nut yet. Once the connection has been made, insert the nut and secure it down. If you're wondering where the wire was routed, I just followed the OEM wire. And here's the reason why I recommended you make your cable longer. This elbow right here sits too close to the radiator. The final connection will be something like this. Next is the negative connection from the alternator to the chassis. And this is the reason why we didn't install this nut yet. Now would be a good time to reinstall the nut and secure it down. So this connection is made from the alternator to the chassis. One connection will be made here to the engine block. Since it was a tight spot, I had to use my impact for this. And this here is our connection. This is the terminal connector that you should have bent a little. With that connected, go ahead and reinstall the nut. With this wire here, I just followed the OEM wires. Here's the wire connected to the starter. I just routed it with the OEM wire. To be honest, I didn't like how close it was to the steering column here. And here's the last wire to the body. Alright, so with everything installed, it's time to reinstall the battery. You should be adding the extra positive terminal connection we made here. Then secure it down. Go ahead and secure the positive terminal connector to the battery as well. Then proceed to make the connection to the negative battery terminal. And secure it down. Last of all, don't forget to enable the breaker. Alright, this project is almost completed. You should have reinstalled your intake pipes, the air filter housing, and the two 12mm bolts securing the radiator. Now looking at my battery, I've always been missing something here. And thanks to our guys at JP3 Motorsports, I can finally secure it down. I'll leave a link for this item in the description below. This would be my first time installing a J-hook in this car. It goes somewhere down here, I believe. Now let's have a look. I hope that's right. This bracket goes over the battery like so, followed by the nut. Now I did run into a small issue here. I'm guessing this battery sits a little taller than it's supposed to. You can see that I have a gap right here. But that's not an issue. All I did was install a longer bolt. And would you look at that, my battery is now secured. Now I would say this project is completed. Now it's time for the test. With my engine at normal operating temperature and at idle, I have my headlights and my fog lights on, as well as the vents for my AC on full blast. And our voltage is still well above 12 volts. Alright, it's looking good. As a side note, you will still get the voltage dip whenever you activate an electronic device on the vehicle, but the voltage will always go back up to 14 when you're at idle. And this is how your belt looks with the engine on. I hope some of you found this video helpful. If you did and you liked it, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed yet, maybe even consider subscribing. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys for the next random project.